it was presented as science, not as a circus act, because these were men of science.
The placing of the boy in the cage of the monkey is an outrage. The Negro race in America has a hard enough time as it is in getting away from the prejudice that it is closely related to the monkey without having a member of the race placed on exhibition with a monkey.
Leading men of science from Harvard and Princeton and Columbia University were saying that Africans were midway between an orangutan and a human being. So 100 years later, it should not come as much of a surprise that many people still cling to these notions of European superiority, African inferiority.
Hello, welcome to Change with Ted Williams. That was a documentary for the film Human Zoos, and we are privileged to have the writer, director, and producer of the film Human Zoos, Dr. John West, joining us today. We also have an African-American history scholar joining us as well, Dr. Daniel Davis. We're going to talk about the film and its implications for not only our world in the United States, but around the world, and so I'm really excited about this conversation. Dr. West, please tell us what inspired you to write this film.
Well, first I learned about the story of Ota Benga, who's this African man who was put on public display in the Bronx Zoo. And I learned about it from a friend years ago, and it intrigued me. He was actually working on a documentary at the time that he was never able to complete. And then a few years ago, wonderful African-American scholar Pamela Newkirk, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, wrote a new book about Ota Benga that I read. She's at New York University, and that further inspired me. And so I have a long-term interest in the use and abuse of science, particularly social Darwinism, and so this played into that. And so the film tells the stories about human zoos and then interweaves the story about eugenics, which was the scientific crusade to breed a better race. And so I wrote a book actually about social Darwinism a few years ago, and so they all sort of came together on this.
But you're a political scientist by training.
Yep.
So how did you get into this?
Well, that's just an interesting thing. I think as a political scientist, I'm interested in how non-political things impact the real world, and so particularly science. Science is a great thing. I mean, you know, I use my iPhone, I use my computer, and it's been a great blessing. But scientists and expert knowledge can be abused just like religion can be abused, just like political ideologies can be abused. And so I've always had that interest of that expert knowledge of, you know, thus says science, therefore we should do it. Well, what happens if that goes awry? And what can we learn from history? I love history.
So to be clear for the audience, this tells a story of the American eugenics movement. A movement in the early 1900s that worked to breed the best and the brightest by race. Yeah. So when you talk about, I know that Ota Benga is sort of one part of the story, but obviously your research has covered eugenics in a larger way. What would you say are sort of the most significant events in history, in American history around this? I mean, what do people need to know about the eugenics movement in America?
Well, the eugenics movement took place for decades, and it was the consensus view of science. It was promoted by politicians and other people, but it was primarily sold as a scientific crusade. So the leading scientists at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, American Association for the Advancement of Science, they said we need to do this because, actually they gave a Darwinian justification. They said, you know, the way we got the way we are is through survival of the fittest, but we are counteracting the law of, you know, survival of the fittest by helping save the poor, save the sick. So we either could go back to the law of the jungle, which they didn't want to do because they said, just like Darwin himself was a kindly man in some of his thoughts, or we could reinstitute it compassionately by trying to mimic natural selection artificially by choosing the best, and particularly the real focus, the really sinister part of eugenics, I mean, there are many sinister parts, but the particularly was getting rid of those they thought were unfit or lower stages of evolution, or you name it, biologically inferior.
Right. And so, I mean, so eugenics had implications beyond just the issue of race. They obviously also were sterilizing people who were of European descent because they felt that they would have children that were ignorant or
correct, or feeble-minded, and just to understand, the racists of the time were racist against non-whites. They were racist against many whites too. So my grandparents came in just before the eugenics-based immigration bill was passed in the 1920s. They came from Eastern Europe. And if you read a book like Madison Grant, one of the people actually behind what happened to Oda Benga in the Bronx Zoo, he didn't like the Slavs either because they were lower on the rung of whites, and so we had to keep them out because they degrade our gene pool.
Dr. Davis, this is not unfamiliar in American history. I mean, this is not an anomaly. This kind of scientific, sociological, these kinds of justifications have existed all throughout American history. Why don't you speak a little bit about sort of how America kind of developed this concept of either race or this concept or this justification for inequality? I know you've done a lot of work around the transatlantic slave trade, and I want you to speak a little about sort of the connection with what you do.
Yeah, well, what we know is that there were several reasons why Africans in particular were primarily chosen or overwhelmingly selected to be chattel slaves, right? But what we know is that the justification for the continuance of taking Africans and making them slaves was based on these beliefs of intellectual inferiority, subhuman characteristics and whatnot. There were reasons for this, several reasons, but one in particular was religion, right? It was this idea that African people didn't believe in Christ. They had these indigenous belief systems or these devil-like religions, right? So they didn't look like the depiction of Jesus. They didn't practice that religion, so they were outside of God's grace. Therefore, that was more of a reason for whites to believe they were superior. So we can take these people that are outside of the eyes of God anyway, they're doomed to eternal fire, if you will, and we can do what we want with them. So that continued to justify that treatment, that ill, horrible, inhumane treatment of these people. The eugenics, people that believe in eugenics were just another example of that. But if we look at scientific racism, it hasn't really went away. Actually, a book, The Bell Curve, in the 90s, right? This book was essentially continuing that same train of thought. This was being taught on college campuses 20 years ago, right? I don't remember the gentleman's name, but I was looking at a YouTube video weeks ago where there was a guy coming back with this idea that the African head was smaller, therefore their brain capacity was smaller. We even know that some assessment tests, particularly in Florida, they were trying to lower the expectation for black students on assessments. 74% was proficiency for blacks, like 88% for whites, 90% for Asians.
Wow.
And just because this expectation that we can do as well because we're not as smart. So this has a long history and it's still here.
So your work has hit these contemporary issues as well. What else is happening today around?
Yeah, sure. I think that part of it, the so-called alt-right, the ideology, if you actually read what the awful things that they're saying, they actually are resurrecting really explicitly some of these Darwinian biological arguments that were made 100 years ago. And fortunately, I think a lot of the mainstream science has rejected that, but you still find people, I mean, James Watson, just a few years ago, the co-discoverer, with Francis Crick of the structure of DNA, was making an argument in a book that, natural selection acts differently on different populations, so why should we expect races to be equal in their capacities? And he particularly said this with regard to African blacks. He said, why should we expect them to be equal to whites, and said that they weren't. And he's a Nobel laureate, so these things do go on. I would say one thing with regard to religion, which I certainly do agree that there are people who made Christian arguments on behalf of racism, but I'd also say that, and one of the things covered in the film, is that the core teachings, I believe, of Christianity, of going back to all people created in the image of God, and certainly the teachings of Jesus himself, of loving everyone, was also a powerful inspiration to most of the people in the anti-slavery movement. And when it came to the story I told, like Oda Benga, it It wasn't the scientist in New York. It wasn't actually the Democratic mayor. It wasn't the New York Times, all of whom were perfectly fine with putting this African man on display in a cage with monkeys. It was a white Baptist minister and then African American clergy, one of which actually someone in right here played.
Yes,
in the
yes.
film.
I didn't mention that, but
and it very well too, very
I appreciate
eloquently.
it. Thank you. If you go watch the film, you might see the scruffy-looking guy.
A very handsome
that,
guy,
well,
very
yes,
eloquent.
yes, I
yeah.
appreciate that very much. But I also appreciate the opportunity to work with you because I think it's a very important project. And as someone who works in the arts and in academia, I find myself desiring to work on projects like that really have some meaning and some substance, so I'm grateful to be a part of it. But I want to ask you, because you brought up this religion question, which I think is a huge, huge issue around this. And I want to speak and ask you about this, because I know we're going to have this conversation a little deeper in a few moments, but Darwin's theory of evolution, okay? The Darwinian theory of evolution. Is that at the heart of the problem, or is this an issue of Darwin's theory being manipulated and abused? So can you separate sort of social Darwinism from Darwin's theory?
That is a fascinating question, and if you'd asked me that 20 years ago, I would have said, yes, of course you can. This was just being Darwin's theory misinterpreted. But then I actually read Darwin's second major big book, The Descent of Man, where he himself actually lays the groundwork for what became eugenics. He actually laments that we're inoculating people against smallpox, we're saving the poor, saving the sick, saving people that natural selection would have killed off, and he said, this is going to destroy us. Now, he then sort of hemmed and hawed, well, we're compassionate, so we can't really do this, and so talked out of both sides of his mouth, but it's there. And his racial scheme, yes, there were lots of racists. Darwin was not the first scientific racist by any means, but the way he built his theory of saying that our fundamental capacities as humans was basically sort of an accidental process based on the particular subgroup you were in and the population pressures, he set up a thing why we should expect there to be significant differences between different people groups. And that laid a groundwork for a lot of, the founder of eugenics, who was one of the leading biologists in America, Charlie Davenport, he took this to he spent his life trying to prove racial inferiority. And he got this from this Darwinian mindset. And so it was the leading scientist. So I think you certainly can believe in evolution without being a racist. There is a fairly close connection, both historically, both in Darwin himself, both in his most eloquent expositors, of something that ties to social Darwinism. Certainly the survival of the fittest, and certainly the idea that, that Darwin himself advocated that Africans and the Aboriginal in Australia were the closest human beings to apes, in his view. And that idea of this hierarchy of, which there were views of that before, but in his theory, he added the scientific gloss, and because his theory was so persuasive to so many people, those ideas ended up having a lot of impact. So I think, it's not a necessary connection. I think it is a logical connection, and certainly historically, that is how many leading scientists. For me, that's actually the biggest thing that I hope that people, one of the big takeaways from this is that not just can, religious believers can be zealous and hypocritical and do bad things, and political people can, but even the so-called best and brightest of the scientists. And so when people say, whether it be, God says this, therefore you have to do it, or science says this with a capital S, therefore you can't even ask any questions, that really isn't great for a free society. It's not great for, it really leads into the sort of tyranny, because I think, we're all fallible, and that's just not a good thing. And I think this is a case study of that.
Absolutely. Well, we have to take a break. You guys are watching Change with Ted Williams. We'll be back in just a moment.
The placing of the boy in the cage with a monkey is an outrage. The Negro race in America has a hard enough time as it is in getting away from the prejudice that is closely related to the monkey without having a member of the race placed on exhibition
leading men of science from Harvard and Princeton and Columbia University were saying that Africans were midway between an orangutan and a human being. So 100 years later, it should not come as much of a surprise that many people still cling to these notions of European superiority, African inferiority.
And that was a clip from the film Human Zoos. Dr. Davis, I want to ask you about how this notion of racial inferiority was promoted by American public policy through the times of slavery in the United States to Jim Crow segregation. This work was not just academic, but people took this justification scientifically and they created public policy from it, and it was very damaging, and I want you to speak for a few moments about that.
Right, absolutely. So again, slavery was obviously justified by this belief in the inferiority of black people or African people or its descendants, right? But then moving into Jim Crow, which was after slavery for about 100 years roughly, we know that this was legalized oppression, legalized segregation based on the same belief in the subhuman characteristics of African people. Therefore, they were a little less citizen because they were a little less human. We know that this went on. Imagine seeing a white only or a colored only sign, how that not only or increases the belief of white people in their superiority, but simultaneously is telling black people constantly that they're not good enough, that there's something not quite right with them. Add to that being geographically located in the poorest communities. So you look around and it's run down and your schools don't have this or that. And so black people are constantly hearing that they're not good enough or that they're second class. And then they look around not understanding all the factors that have contributed to their space or station in the country. And it's kind of reaffirming this belief like maybe something is quite not right with us.
Yeah, I would imagine that, and I think about this a lot, but not just for people who are non-African American sort of see the conditions of African American people or other minorities and go, my goodness, these people must not work hard, they must be lazy.
Exactly.
But I would imagine, I've seen it and heard it from other African Americans who accept the same level of inferiority based on the conditions that they see.
Absolutely, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I'm going to tell you that you're nothing. I'm going to take all your resources away from you so that you are failing, and then say, see, I told you were nothing, right? And in my courses, I'm constantly talking to my students about when we talk about history and the conditions of African Americans, I always say this class is not going to be about bashing white people. We're going to talk about what happened in white America to influence us, but I'm more concerned with what's going on with the black psyche. How much of this nonsense, this white supremacy have we absorbed? How much of it do we now believe? And how is that hurting us from progressing? And the things in this film, it was an amazing film. This scientific racism is at the core of this self-hatred that I feel many African Americans suffer from today. And I think that is arguably just as impactful or just as stifling to our progression as current white supremacy and oppression and inequality.
You know, I was talking to someone yesterday from an immigrant community, from an African immigrant community, and they were talking about how, unlike African Americans, this particular community did not feel any real need to push for political power in America. And they were asking, well, why do African Americans feel so much that they need to do this? And I would imagine that African Americans look at the same documents that other Americans look at.
Right.
You know, all men are created equal. And they see these things and they go, you know, we may be better off than some third world country here in America as minorities, but I'm looking at what it says on paper. Thomas Jefferson himself, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, also wrote a book called Notes on the State of Virginia, in which he basically argued that Africans were inferior. I want to ask you, what is the connection between Jefferson and the work in eugenics that you've talked about? Is there an overt connection? Was Jefferson, well, actually, obviously Jefferson predates the eugenics movement, but I would imagine because Jefferson was the first major American to write explicitly about this notion of inferiority, there's a trend, a strand that's running through. Is there any of your work that kind of touches on that at all? Or?
Yeah, I mean, Jefferson is an interesting example because he recognized that slavery was wrong, but he was a slaveholder, and then he wrote, you're right, I read the note to the state of Virginia, very demeaning. What's interesting in this area of religion is that although there were certainly Christian justifications in the South of slavery, when that note to the state of Virginia came out, I think Samuel Stanhope Smith, president of Princeton, and others actually attacked Jefferson on that, citing Acts 17 and that the idea that the King James Version where it says of one blood God made everyone, he said Jefferson, the infidel, is going against that and that this is completely wrong. And so he actually did get some pushback at the time because the debate was beginning to start in America with Quakers and others who were anti-slavery. But I'd say the connection, there is a bit of a connection. So Jefferson was very much smitten with secular progress and that human beings would, he thought the French Revolution was great until it sort of lots of other things happened. And so I think behind some of this social Darwinism was this sort of human perfectionism that, well, now we're the best and brightest, so we can engineer the perfect society on earth, and we'll do it using this presumption of scientific racism. And what Daniel was talking about earlier about like IQ testing and things, that was engineered by the same people who brought you eugenics. I mean, it's historically very true. And then in the African American community, I mean, this may be controversial to say, but Margaret Sanger.
Oh yeah.
I'm not against birth control.
About Margaret Sanger.
I'm not against birth control, but Margaret Sanger was not an exemplary figure, and she, among other places, went and lectured to the Ku Klux Klan. And why? Well, because she had she had these exact same views. If you actually read her books, she thought blacks were inferior. It was for this Darwinian scientific racism. She thought immigrants were, a drag on things, and she, this goes deep.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
It's also important to note, though, because I agree with you, the religious or faith-based community certainly played a role in anti-slavery activism, right? But remember, there's a difference too between being you can be anti-slavery and anti-black at the same time. So what we know about a lot of even the Quakers, right? We know about a lot of these religious figures that fought to end slavery still didn't want a black man dating their daughter.
Correct. And many of them
we see
wanted
a lot of that today.
Shipped back to Africa. And that was their thing.
100%.
I agree with that.
So they can simultaneously say slavery's wrong for everybody, but still these people are inferior beings, and they still don't quite deserve the same rights that we deserve. And we have myriad evidence of that too. So but I agree though, absolutely. It's not just that religion played a role in the beginning of slavery and the foundation or the groundwork for racism. It also did help fight against these things, absolutely. So I just wanted to make sure it's a nuance.
That's very, very important. So not that we're at the end of the program, but I do want to continue to move sort of in this contemporary space. Obviously, we see how the movement of the alt-right and other groups like that have really, I think, revived some of these conversations. But I really want to know, what do we need to do, right? What do we need to do educationally? What do we need to do socially, politically, to reverse what it is that we're talking about now?
Watch his film. We need more films like this.
I really think one part of it is if you don't know the past, you can't see the same things happening as easily, or you dismiss it. And so I think that's sort of negative, but I think forewarned is forearmed. Once you see it, then you can recognize the same things today. And then there are lots of positive things that science has brought out about our DNA is the same. We're one human race. And so there are things, so this is not anti-science, but I think people do need to understand what happened in the past so that they can see and be warned about things today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I said it jokingly, but seriously, films like yours, right? Spreading this information. Shockingly, a lot of people don't fully understand or really give enough respect to how much energy was put into dividing us in this country. So the first step is to become aware and then have dialogues, have conversations. Even in the African American community, understandably so, a lot of us are angry about the inequality and the racism and the unfair treatment that we experience. But at the same time, we have to be willing to have those conversations with those that are willing to hear us, those that are willing to come to the table and have some kind of understanding, right? But additionally, I think without sounding too negative, right, or pessimistic, I think African Americans, we have to stop waiting for white America to correct itself, right? We have to continue to push ourselves forward and do what we have to do in spite of what's going on. In my class, I always say, we're talking about all these horrible things that happen, but I always say, now what, right? Every time. Okay, so we had 50 minutes talking about all these horrible things. We end the class with, now what? What are we gonna do now? What's the next step? And it's on us. You can write letters to your congressman and all these people all you want, but we have a lot of evidence that says that moves very slowly, and oftentimes it doesn't get the results we need. So how can we become self-reliant in our communities? What can we do within ourselves, within our families, and our block to make our lives better? And then we can also come to the table to try to have this racial harmony that we all think is necessary.
Speaking, very well said. Thank you, sir. That was speaking of learning history, what has been the reaction to your film?
That's interesting. I think a lot positive, a lot of people shocked they didn't know about it, especially in the white community, right, shown it. There has been some things that have shocked me because I have had some people push back who are really from the racist perspective and actually criticizing, why are you inflaming this and how dare you? There was one review on Amazon that was quite, I mean, it was shocking to me. But I mean, it wasn't, I mean, I know those people are out there, but I've gotten some pushback in that way too.
People who don't want you to tell the story, people who don't believe the story?
A combination of, they think telling the story will inflame things. And I do understand that, you know, it's not, we want to get to a society where all people are valued and all people can flourish. And so I understand, you know, some concerns about, you know, rage that might be counterproductive. But then there's also some of the beliefs, well, but people are different, as in, there are racial inferiorities, and there have been some people who've said that. Not many, but enough that it really bothers some.
Well, and, you know, it's interesting. This is our second time having this conversation. We were able to do this for a group of college students yesterday, actually, in the City Colleges of Chicago. And part of our discussion then got into the idea of race as a myth, scientifically. And we haven't spent a lot of time talking about that, and we may not have a ton of time to talk about it, but I think it's important for our audience to understand that race is a biological myth and that it really is socially constructed, and the definition of racial groups has changed consistently over the years and could continue to change as we go forward. So this notion that people are fundamentally different, it just doesn't hold up under any real scrutiny.
Well, and the evidence is that from however you think humans came to be, that from the very first time we see in history, you have language, you have abstract reasoning, you have funeral rituals, you have use of tools, you have all fire making. I mean, it's really the fundamental capacities of all humans are quite similar. And yes, there are variations because of culture and other things, but it's just the evidence really is strong. And if you look at the evidence itself rather than put this superstructure on, well, we need to fit it to our theory, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we look at these issues, that doesn't negate cultural differences. And I think those are important to recognize, and even geographic differences that are a byproduct of, you know, evolution within human beings, right? Skin color, that sort of thing. But that doesn't necessarily, you know, I don't think they're mutually exclusive ideas. I think you can acknowledge those surface differences while still rebutting this notion that we're fundamentally different.
And this is the truth, but let's be realistic. If I'm a white heterosexual male, I'm on the winning team, right? This racial myth is working for me.
Sure.
So essentially what we're asking white America to do is to give up some of their privilege in the sake of truth, for the sake of truth. Is that realistic? Is that a realistic goal? To try to appeal to white America to say, look, we're all the same, everybody. Like, we just have to teach white America that we're all the same people. And then they'll say, okay, let me give up some of my privilege and be equal to everybody else. I don't know if that's realistic. But what the optimism I feel, and this may be like kind of out there, right? But I think that the more white people become poor, because we see the bigger gap in economics, I think the more white people begin to suffer in this country because of the elites, they'll start to understand some of the struggle of people of color. And my vision is that eventually this gap that we see in race will start to diminish more and more, and it's going to become more and more classes, right? It's going to be, and there's going to be so many people that are suffering of different colors and different whatever, that we're going to start to see the true enemy is that top echelon of people that are hurting, that's exploiting everybody. I think that'll happen before we see racial harmony, sadly. And again, I didn't want to be too pessimistic, but just being realistic.
Yeah, and
I think economic parity and economic understanding will come before universal racial understanding.
Well, that's a.
But we never should stop fighting for it.
That's a different view of utopia, racial harmony. So we'll all be poor together, and then we'll be okay.
Once we're poor together, then we'll start to unite around poor.
And you know, it's funny, and I would imagine, and I think about sort of history, and both of you are historians. In that way, I would suggest that there are a lot of cases in history that show maybe the opposite happens.
Well, that's
and maybe tribalism increases when people are struggling. So I don't know. I hope you're right.
I think that's because poor whites are believing the lie of rich whites that they're all on the same team. Yeah. I think poor white people are still dividing themselves from others because rich whites still have them connecting around whiteness, but really they're totally separate.
Well, John, on this panel, you are the expert on white America, so maybe you could answer that question.
I would just say that I think there is another perhaps way to look at it, depending on one's view of economics, that whether that through entrepreneurship and the right sort of economic freedom, not crony capitalism, not where you give favor to monopolies, I think there are downsides to that, but actually economic freedom, when the rules are fair, can lead to everyone flourishing, and whether it be an African American community. And I say, without passing judgment on current things in politics, right now unemployment among African Americans has gone down significantly. Now, does that mean that's where it needs to be? No, absolutely not. On the other hand, I think it may give a foretaste of if we actually do get to an area with a level playing field of fairness, how through human initiative, human creativity that is in the spark of everyone, that if you don't have these artificial barriers placed on people, that you will have, rather than taking down some people, you'll actually have everyone flourishing. Because I'd say that the history of, say, a socialist approach, I think, to economics has not been good worldwide for leaving flourishing to anyone. So.
Well, I hope that we can figure this out. I mean, I do, and I mean that sincerely. It has been the Achilles heel of this country since its inception. I think it'll be this country's downfall if we don't figure out a way to do this. Dr. King had a famous quote that says that unless we learn to live together as brothers, we'll perish together as fools. And that's it in this country. And so I don't know how we get there. I'm always amazed at how little time we spend in the educational process preparing people to live in a diverse society. I think we just assume it's going to happen. And this is a very diverse society, and we wonder why people have these stereotypes, these assumptions. I think we've got to work from the beginning of the educational process to prepare us to live in this space. And so I appreciate the work both of you all do. I thank you all so much for coming. We are out of time today, but this has been a great conversation. Please watch the film Human Zoos. It is amazing. And like I said, there's a little actor you might want to check out in there too, if you get a chance. I hope you enjoy that. But I do hope you support it. And more importantly, I hope that each one of you figures out a way to affect change, not only in your local community, your local life, your neighborhood, your home, but to affect change around the world. And that's really what this show is about and these conversations are about. How can each one of us change our lives and then change the world? We'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.